The bustling Atlanta International Airport was experiencing its usual morning rush as passengers hurried to their gates. At Gate B23, first-class passengers were lining up for the early morning flight to Los Angeles. Among them stood a man in an expensive suit, continuously glancing at his Rolex watch while talking loudly on his phone about an upcoming business deal. "Of course I'll be flying first class," he announced into his phone, his voice deliberately loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I wouldn't be caught dead in economy. Do you know how many rewards points I have?" He laughed dismissively, casting judgmental looks at the other passengers. The gate agent began the boarding process, calling for first-class passengers first. The businessman pushed his way to the front of the line, barely acknowledging the gate agent's greeting. As he walked down the jet bridge, he made sure everyone noticed his designer briefcase and the platinum frequent flyer tag attached to it. Behind him in line was a woman wearing a professional blazer and carrying a medical conference folder. She walked with quiet confidence, politely thanking the gate agent as she scanned her boarding pass. Her first-class ticket was a splurge she'd allowed herself after being invited as a keynote speaker at a major pediatric surgery conference in Los Angeles. As passengers filed onto the plane, the businessman made a show of storing his designer luggage in the overhead compartment, sighing dramatically when others needed to pass by him. Careful with that, he snapped at another passenger who accidentally brushed against his jacket. The woman approached her assigned seat, which happened to be next to the businessman. She double-checked her ticket, seat 2B. As she prepared to sit down, the man looked up from his phone with a frown. His eyes moved from her to her seat number and back again, his expression growing increasingly disapproving. "I believe there's been a mistake," he said loudly, not addressing her directly, but making sure his voice carried. "Flight attendant, could you come here, please?" He raised his hand as if he was summoning a servant. A flight attendant approached with a professional smile. "How can I help you, sir?" "Yes, there seems to be some confusion with the seating arrangement," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the woman who was still standing in the aisle. "This is the first-class cabin, correct?" The woman remained composed, holding out her boarding pass. "My seat is 2B, she said calmly, her voice steady despite the obvious implication of his question. The flight attendant quickly confirmed that everything was in order. "Well," the man muttered, barely attempting to hide his disdain, "I suppose mistakes can happen." He made a show of shifting closer to the window, as if trying to create as much distance as possible between himself and his seatmate. Other first-class passengers watched the scene unfold with varying expressions of discomfort and disapproval. Some buried their heads in magazines or phones, pretending not to notice. Others exchanged knowing glances, having witnessed similar scenarios before. The woman took her seat with grace, pulled out a medical journal from her bag, and began reading. The cover prominently displayed an article about innovative pediatric surgery techniques, her article, in fact, though she felt no need to point this out to her prejudiced seat neighbor. The businessman continued to fidget and sigh, making small but audible comments under his breath about standards these days and back when first class meant something. Each comment was clearly intended to be heard while maintaining a thin veneer of plausible deniability. In the row directly behind them, another passenger watched this interaction with growing concern. His weathered hands gripped the armrests a little tighter with each of the businessman's thinly veiled insults. The man's military bearing was supple but noticeable to those who knew what to look for, and his eyes never left the scene unfolding in front of him. As the remaining passengers boarded, the tension in the first-class cabin was palpable. The businessman kept finding excuses to flag down flight attendants, asking pointed questions about the drink service, meal options, and blanket quality. Anything to demonstrate that he was a real first-class passenger who knew what to expect. The woman maintained her composure, immersing herself in her medical journal while occasionally making polite conversation with the flight attendants who seemed to go out of their way to show her extra kindness, perhaps to compensate for her seatmate's behavior. The plane began its final preparations for takeoff. The businessman made one last phone call, speaking even louder than before about his important meetings in Los Angeles and his exclusive hotel reservation. Meanwhile, the woman quietly fastened her seatbelt and reviewed her conference notes, her professional accomplishments speaking far louder than any boastful phone conversation could. Little did anyone know that this flight would become memorable for reasons far beyond typical travel discomforts. The businessman's arrogant behavior was about to trigger a chain of events that would leave every passenger on that plane with a story to tell, a story about prejudice, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the businessman's behavior only grew worse. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, making a show of leaning away every time the woman next to him moved even slightly. The flight attendant approached with the drink cart, offering the first-class passengers their pre-lunch beverages. "I'll have your finest scotch," the businessman announced loudly. "Neat, of course. I assume you carry premium brands in first class." He emphasized the words first class while glancing sideways at his seatmate. The flight attendant maintained her professional composure as she poured his drink. When she turned to the woman and asked for her drink preference, the businessman interrupted. "Are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable in the back?" he asked, his voice dripping with fake concern. "I'm sure the flight attendant could find you a seat in economy if you're not used to this level of service." The woman looked up from her medical journal, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time. "I'm quite comfortable where I am, thank you," she replied calmly, then turned to the flight attendant. "I'll have sparkling water with lime, please." The businessman scoffed and muttered under his breath, "Probably the first time in first class. Doesn't even know what to order." His voice was just loud enough for those nearby to hear, yet quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability if confronted. A few rows behind them, other passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others pretended to be absorbed in their books or tablets, trying to ignore the growing tension. The situation escalated when the woman pulled out her laptop to review her conference presentation. The screen displayed complex surgical procedures and medical terminology that she would be presenting at the Pediatric Surgery Conference. The businessman glanced at her screen and let out a dismissive laugh. "Plain doctor, are we?" he sneered. "I suppose anyone can download impressive-looking presentations these days." The woman closed her eyes briefly, took a deep breath, and continued working on her presentation. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as she refined the details of a groundbreaking surgical technique she had developed. The flight attendant, who had been keeping a watchful eye on the situation, approached with a warm smile. "Doctor, would you like to review our lunch menu?" she asked, deliberately emphasizing the title. The businessman's expression flickered briefly as the word doctor registered. But rather than backing down, he doubled down on his behavior. "Doctor," he said with exaggerated surprise. "Of what? Hair braiding?" He chuckled at his own joke, looking around as if expecting others to join in. Instead, he was met with stony silence from nearby passengers. The woman maintained her dignity, simply saying, "I'm a pediatric surgeon. I'm heading to Los Angeles to deliver a keynote speech at a medical conference." Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, without a hint of defensiveness. The businessman's face reddened slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Well, I suppose they're letting everyone into medical school these days. Standards aren't what they used to be." He took a long sip of his scotch, his hand slightly unsteady. Behind them, the military veteran's jaw clenched tighter with each comment. His weathered hands gripped his armrests, his knuckles turning white. He had seen too much in his life to sit quietly through such blatant discrimination. The tension in the first-class cabin continued to build as the flight progressed. The businessman kept finding new ways to make snide comments, each one more thinly veiled than the last. He questioned the authenticity of her medical degree, made assumptions about affirmative action, and continuously suggested that she was somehow out of place. What he didn't know was that the woman he was attempting to belittle had performed life-saving surgeries on hundreds of children. She had pioneered new surgical techniques that were being taught in medical schools across the country. Her research had been published in leading medical journals, and she had been invited to speak at conferences around the world. The woman excused herself to use the restroom, rising gracefully from her seat. As she walked down the aisle, the businessman made what would prove to be his biggest mistake. He thought she was out of earshot when he turned to the passenger across the aisle and said, "Can you believe they let someone like that in first class? This airline really has gone downhill." It was this comment that finally pushed the veteran in the row behind them over the edge. He had seen too much in his years of service, had lost too many good people to stay silent in the face of such ignorance. As the woman made her way back to her seat, He prepared himself to speak up, not with anger or violence, but with a truth that needed to be heard. Little did the businessman know, his world was about to be turned upside down by the quiet man sitting behind him. The next few minutes would change not only his perspective, but also the atmosphere of the entire first-class cabin. The veteran leaned forward in his seat, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority that comes from years of military service. "Excuse me, sir," he said, addressing the businessman. "I couldn't help but overhear your comments, and I have something I'd like to share with you." The businessman turned around, initially annoyed at being addressed, but something in the veteran's bearing made him hold his tongue. The older man's eyes held a steady gaze that commanded attention, and his military bearing was unmistakable. 25 years ago, the veteran began, his voice steady and clear enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I was serving in a combat zone when our unit came under heavy fire. I took a hit that should have killed me." He paused, letting his words sink in. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but the veteran continued. "The surgeon who saved my life that day was a black woman. She worked for 16 straight hours, not just on me, but on everyone who came through those doors. She didn't care about our race, our rank, or our background. All she cared about was saving lives." The first-class cabin had grown quiet. Even the flight attendants paused their service to listen. The woman, who had returned to her seat, sat silently, her eyes focused straight ahead, but her attention clearly on the veteran's words. "That surgeon," the veteran continued, "had faced discrimination her entire career. People questioned her abilities, doubted her qualifications, made assumptions about how she got her position." He leaned slightly closer to the businessman. "People just like you, sir." The businessman's face flushed red. "I didn't mean to. I was just," he stammered, but the veteran wasn't finished. "When you're bleeding out in a medical tent, sir, you don't care about the color of the hands that save you. When your child needs emergency surgery, you don't question the background of the surgeon who can save their life." His voice remained calm but carried an undeniable intensity. Other passengers began nodding in agreement. An elderly woman across the aisle wiped tears from her eyes. The flight attendant stood nearby, a look of quiet approval on her face. "I've served alongside people of every race, religion, and background," the veteran continued. "And I learned that courage, skill, and dedication have nothing to do with what someone looks like. They have everything to do with what's in their heart and mind." He gestured toward the woman's medical conference materials. "This doctor sitting next to you isn't just a surgeon, she's speaking at a conference. She's teaching others. She's probably saved more lives than you and I could count. And yet you've spent this entire flight trying to make her feel like she doesn't belong here." The businessman looked down at his hands, unable to meet the veteran's gaze. The woman remained composed, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "You know what real status is, sir?" the veteran asked rhetorically. "It's not about what seat you sit in on a plane or what kind of watch you wear. It's about how you treat people. It's about the lives you touch and the difference you make in this world." A young passenger a few rows back started clapping softly, and others joined in. The businessman sank lower in his seat, the gravity of his behavior finally hitting him. "I've seen too many good people die in service to this country," the veteran said, his voice softening slightly. "They died protecting the idea that all people are created equal, that everyone deserves respect and dignity. When I see someone disrespecting those ideals, well," he paused, "I consider it my duty to speak up." The woman finally turned to face the businessman. "Would you like to see what I'm presenting at the conference?" she asked gently, showing more kindness than many felt he deserved. "It's a new surgical technique that could help children with heart defects." The businessman, now thoroughly humbled, nodded silently. As the woman began explaining her work, other passengers leaned in to listen. The veteran sat back in his seat, watching as the same businessman who had been so dismissive now listened intently to the doctor's explanation of her groundbreaking research. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had transformed completely. What had started as a tense, uncomfortable situation had become a moment of learning and understanding. Passengers who had been avoiding eye contact were now engaged in conversation, sharing their own experiences with prejudice and the importance of standing up against it. The veteran had done more than just confront a single instance of discrimination. He had reminded everyone on that flight about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and treating all people with respect and dignity. As the flight continued, the businessman sat quietly, absorbing everything that had just happened. The doctor was now engaged in conversation with several other passengers who had become interested in her work after hearing the veteran's powerful words. "Your surgical technique," asked a young woman from across the aisle. "How many children has it helped?" The doctor's eyes lit up as she explained how her procedure had reduced recovery times and improved success rates for complicated pediatric heart surgeries. The businessman listened intently, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine shame and interest. He watched as the doctor pulled up images on her laptop, showing before and after scans of young patients whose lives had been changed by her work. "The youngest patient I operated on was just 3 days old," the doctor explained, her voice full of compassion. "Without this procedure, that baby might not have survived. Today, she's a healthy 5-year-old who loves ballet and finger painting." The veteran observed this transformation with quiet satisfaction. He noticed how other passengers who had previously remained silent were now actively participating in the conversation, sharing their own stories of prejudice and learning. An elderly lady spoke up from 2 rows ahead. "I was a nurse for 40 years, she said. "I've seen so many brilliant doctors face discrimination. It breaks my heart that we're still fighting these battles today." She turned to face the businessman directly. "But it's never too late to learn and change." The businessman cleared his throat nervously. I owe you an apology," he finally said to the doctor, his voice barely above a whisper. "My behavior was inexcusable. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and I'm truly sorry." The doctor nodded graciously. "Thank you for that," she replied. "Perhaps something good can come from this situation if it helps us all reflect on our hidden biases." A flight attendant who had witnessed everything approached with fresh drinks for everyone. "It's not often we see moments like this on our flights," she said warmly. "Usually, people just keep their heads down and stay quiet when they witness discrimination." The veteran spoke up again, his voice gentle but firm. "Staying quiet is what allows prejudice to thrive," he said. "I've seen too many good people hurt because others chose to remain silent." He shared another story from his military days about a young medic who had saved his entire unit during a difficult mission. She faced double discrimination, both for her gender and her race. But when bullets are flying, nobody cares about anything except whether you can do your job. She could, and she did it brilliantly. The businessman absorbed these words, looking increasingly uncomfortable with his earlier behavior. "I run a large company," he admitted. "I wonder how many talented people we've overlooked because of assumptions like the ones I made today." This sparked a broader discussion throughout the first-class cabin. A young tech executive shared how his company had transformed after implementing blind hiring practices. An older gentleman talked about how his granddaughter, a black woman in medical school, faced similar prejudices despite being top of her class. The doctor listened to these stories with a knowing smile. "These conversations are important," she said. "They remind us that change is possible, but it requires both speaking up and listening." The veteran nodded in agreement. "Sometimes it takes an uncomfortable moment like this to make us examine our own biases," he said. "I've learned that courage isn't just about facing physical dangers, it's about facing the truth about ourselves and being willing to change." As the flight approached its final hour, the atmosphere in the cabin had completely transformed. What had started as a tense, hostile environment had become a space for open dialogue and understanding. The businessman took out his business card and handed it to the doctor. "I would like to make a donation to your research program," he said sincerely. "And perhaps you might consider giving a talk at our company about diversity in medicine." The doctor accepted the card with grace. "I would be happy to," she replied. "Change happens one conversation at a time." The veteran watched this exchange with satisfaction. He hadn't spoken up for recognition or praise, but because it was the right thing to do. His actions had created a ripple effect, turning an ugly situation into an opportunity for growth and understanding. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the conversation in the first-class cabin continued to evolve in unexpected ways. The businessman, who had been quietly reflecting on his behavior, suddenly turned to face the veteran. "You mentioned serving in combat," he said softly. Would you mind telling us more about your experience with that surgeon who saved your life? His voice carried genuine curiosity rather than his earlier condescension. The veteran shifted in his seat, his eyes growing distant with memory. It was during a particularly difficult mission, he began. Our unit had been caught in an ambush, and I took a hit that severed a major artery. By the time they got me to the medical tent, I had lost so much blood that most people thought I was already gone. The cabin grew quiet as passengers leaned in to listen. Even the flight attendants paused their preparations for landing, drawn in by the veteran's story. That surgeon worked on me for hours, he continued. She refused to give up, even when others said it was hopeless. I later learned that she had already been on duty for 18 hours straight, but she still gave everything she had to save my life. The doctor listened intently, her own experiences reflected in the story. The businessman's face showed a mix of shame and understanding as the veteran continued. After I recovered, I tried to thank her, the veteran said, his voice growing softer. Know what she told me? She said, "Don't thank me. Just make sure you live a life worthy of being saved." He paused, letting the words sink in. That's what I've tried to do ever since, including speaking up when I see injustice. A young flight attendant wiped away a tear as she passed by. The businessman looked down at his expensive watch, seemingly seeing it differently now. I've spent my entire career focusing on status symbols, he admitted. The right car, the right clothes, the right seat on the plane. But today made me realize I've been measuring success all wrong. The doctor, who had remained mostly quiet during this exchange, spoke up. In my operating room, she said, I've never seen a heart that cared about the color of the hands that healed it. Rich or poor, black or white, every heart just wants to keep beating. The veteran nodded in agreement. That's what I learned in service too, he said. When you're fighting alongside someone, or when you're trying to save their life, all those surface differences just melt away. What matters is what's inside a person. Other passengers began sharing their own stories. A young mother talked about how a black female doctor had saved her child's life. An elderly man shared his experience of changing his prejudices after being cared for by a diverse medical team during a heart attack. The businessman listened to each story, his transformation evident in his face and posture. I keep thinking about my own daughter, he said quietly. She wants to be a doctor. What if someone treated her the way I treated you? He asked, turning to the doctor. Then I hope someone would have the courage to speak up, just like this gentleman did, the doctor replied, nodding toward the veteran. That's how change happens, one person speaking up, one mind opening up, one heart changing at a time. The veteran reached into his wallet and pulled out an old, worn photograph. This is the surgeon who saved me, he said, passing it to the businessman. She passed away last year, still serving others until her final days. She faced discrimination her entire career, but never let it stop her from saving lives. The businessman studied the photograph, then passed it back with trembling hands. I feel like I've been asleep, he said, or wearing blinders. How many times have I acted this way without someone brave enough to call me out? The important thing, the veteran said firmly, is what you do from this moment forward. Every day is a chance to be better than we were yesterday. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing everyone to grip their armrests. In that moment of shared vulnerability, all artificial barriers seemed to dissolve. They were just humans sharing a journey together, both literally and figuratively. As the plane prepared for its final descent into Los Angeles, the impact of the day's events continued to ripple through the first-class cabin. The flight attendant made her final rounds, collecting empty cups and ensuring seatbelts were fastened. You know, the businessman said, breaking a moment of reflective silence, my company has a foundation that supports various causes. We've never focused on medical education or diversity in healthcare. He turned to the doctor with newfound respect in his eyes. Would you be willing to help us change that? The doctor smiled warmly. I would be honored. Many talented young people don't pursue medicine because they don't see anyone who looks like them in the field. Sometimes, all it takes is one role model to change that. The veteran listened with approval as they exchanged contact information. This is how real change happens, he said, not just through grand gestures, but through small actions that create ripple effects. A young woman sitting across the aisle raised her hand slightly. I need to confess something, she said, her voice trembling. When all this started, I stayed quiet. I saw what was happening but was afraid to speak up. I feel ashamed about that now. We've all been there, the veteran responded kindly. The important thing is to learn from it. Next time, you'll know what to do. The businessman nodded in agreement. I've learned that staying silent when we witness discrimination makes us part of the problem. I've been both the problem and the silent bystander. Today has shown me I need to be better on both counts. The doctor pulled out her conference presentation again. Look at these statistics, she said, pointing to a slide. The survival rates for certain procedures improve significantly when hospitals have diverse medical teams. It's not just about fairness, it's about saving lives. An older passenger who had been quietly observing everything spoke up. I'm on the board of a major hospital, he said. We've been discussing diversity initiatives, but there's been pushback. Would you both, he looked at the doctor and the veteran, be willing to speak at our next board meeting? The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and everyone grabbed their armrests. In that moment of shared vulnerability, the businessman laughed softly. It's amazing how quickly our prejudices disappear when we're all in the same boat, or plane, in this case. The flight attendant returned for the final landing check. In all my years of flying, she said, I've never seen a transformation quite like this. Usually, when there's tension in the cabin, it just stays tense. The veteran smiled. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to speak up. The hardest part is being that first voice. As the plane descended toward Los Angeles, the businessman turned to the doctor one last time. I owe you more than just an apology, he said. I owe you a commitment to change, not just words, but actions. The doctor nodded appreciatively. Change isn't always comfortable, she replied, but it's always possible. What matters is what we do next. Other passengers began sharing their own commitments to change. One promised to speak up next time they'd witnessed discrimination. Another talked about reviewing their company's hiring practices. A third discussed starting mentorship programs for underrepresented youth. The plane touched down smoothly, and as passengers prepared to disembark, there was a sense that something significant had shifted. Phone numbers were exchanged, connections were made, and promises were sealed with handshakes. The businessman insisted on carrying the doctor's conference materials. It's the least I can do, he said, and I'll be following up about that foundation work. As they walked through the terminal, other passengers from the flight stopped to thank the veteran for his courage in speaking up. He accepted their gratitude with humility, repeatedly emphasizing that anyone can be the voice that sparks change. Just before they all parted ways, the veteran shared one final thought. Remember, what happened today wasn't just about one flight or one incident. It's about the choice we all have, every day, to either perpetuate prejudice or stand against it. 6 months after that memorable flight, a special event was being held at one of Los Angeles's largest hospitals. The businessman stood at a podium, addressing a diverse crowd of medical professionals, students, and community leaders. Half a year ago, I was a different person, he began, his voice carrying both humility and purpose. I was someone who judged people based on their appearance, someone who thought success could be measured by the cost of a watch or the class of an airline ticket. In the audience, the doctor from the flight sat next to the veteran, both smiling as they listened. The businessman continued his speech, describing how a single flight had changed his perspective forever. Today, I'm proud to announce that our company's foundation is establishing a $10 million scholarship fund for underrepresented students in medicine, he announced. This fund will help ensure that talent and dedication, not background or appearance, determine who gets to save lives. The audience broke into applause. In the front row, a group of high school students, aspiring doctors from diverse backgrounds, beamed with hope and excitement. But this isn't just about money, the businessman continued. It's about changing mindsets. Over the past 6 months, our company has completely revamped our hiring practices. We've implemented blind resume reviews, expanded our recruitment efforts, and established mentorship programs. He gestured to the doctor, inviting her to join him on stage. This remarkable surgeon, whom I once treated with such disrespect, has been instrumental in helping us understand how to create real change. She's now a leading advisor to our foundation. The doctor took the microphone, sharing how the incident had led to unexpected positive changes. What could have remained an ugly moment of discrimination became a catalyst for transformation, she said. Since that flight, we've established programs in 3 major hospitals to support diversity in medical residency programs. The veteran was called to the stage next. His presence still carried that quiet authority that had commanded attention on the plane. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures, he said. Sometimes it comes from simply having the courage to speak up when we witness injustice. The event showcased the real-world impact of their collaboration. 20 students had already received scholarships, and partnerships had been formed with medical schools across the country. The businessman's company had become a leader in promoting workplace diversity, inspiring other corporations to follow suit. One of the scholarship recipients, a young student from a disadvantaged background, shared her story. "I never thought becoming a doctor was possible for someone like me," she said, her voice full of emotion. "Now I know that not only is it possible, but there are people who will support my journey." The flight attendant from that day had been invited too. She stood up to share how the airline had implemented new training programs for staff on handling discrimination. "That one flight showed us we needed to do better," she explained. "Now we train our crews not just in service, but in standing up for what's right." Near the end of the event, the businessman shared a final story. "Last week, my daughter got accepted to medical school," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "When she called to tell me, she said something that brought me to tears. She said, 'Dad, I'm proud that you learned to change.'" The veteran stood one last time, looking out at the audience. "On that flight, we were strangers brought together by circumstance. Today, we're partners in creating change. Remember, it's never too late to learn, to grow, and to become better than we were yesterday." After the event, as people mingled and shared stories, the doctor, the businessman, and the veteran stood together, marveling at how a single interaction had sparked such widespread change. "You know what the best part is?" the businessman said, looking at the young scholarship recipients chatting excitedly about their future. "This is just the beginning." The doctor nodded in agreement. Every one of these students will go on to save lives, inspire others, and create their own ripples of change. The veteran smiled, watching the scene before him. "Sometimes the most important battles we fight aren't on traditional battlefields," he said quietly. "They're in everyday moments when we choose to stand up for what's right." As the evening drew to a close, it was clear that what had started as an ugly incident on a plane had transformed into something powerful and lasting, a reminder that change is always possible, that one voice can make a difference, and that it's never too late to choose a better path. The story of that flight continues to be shared, inspiring others to speak up, stand up, and work toward a world where everyone is judged not by their appearance, but by the content of their character and the quality of their contributions.